Senator, thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Good to see you, Jeff.
Wanted to talk to you about your educational program that you were talking about here today. You called this one of the most significant bills since the GI Bill.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, this is legislation I've introduced that would provide $10 billion a year, or $100 billion over 10 years, in federal tax credits for contributions to education scholarship granting organizations. And half of that would be K through 12 education, giving kids more educational options, expanding the opportunities available to K through 12 kids. The other half is focused on workforce development. It's focused on things like apprenticeships and vocational training. Today I'm here in Corsicana, and when we just toured the Oil City Iron Works, the oldest foundry in the state of Texas, and they've got about 250 jobs right here, good paying jobs, but there's an incredible need for skilled workers, for foundry workers, for welders, for carpenters and electricians and plumbers and linemen, and there's a disconnect between a number of adults who may not necessarily have the skills that today's economy is demanding, and the jobs that our economy is producing. And so this is designed to be implemented at the state level. So it's a federal tax credit that states can opt into and states implement, but to provide real resources so that we can have, number one, our kids receive the best educational outcomes, but number two, we can have more and more adults having good careers and providing for their families.
So how will the bill make a difference, and how quickly do you think it could make a difference? Because Texas is booming, right?
Texas is absolutely booming. By the way, the math of this would work out. It's $10 billion a year. Texas would be entitled to about $1 billion of that, $1 billion of scholarships in the state of Texas, half of that for K through 12, half of that for vocational and technical training. And really what we need to do, though, is we need to see a coalition come together in Congress to pass this. Where I am right now, I've got a lot of Republicans supporting the bill. We've unified many of the Republicans in the Senate, but we need to build more Democratic support. And so a lot of what I'm doing is touring the state, meeting with blue-collar factories, meeting with union leaders, working to build a coalition behind this so that it becomes compelling and a bipartisan initiative. If and when we get this passed, this will be the most significant federal educational initiative since the GI Bill in terms of $100 billion of scholarships to expand educational options for Texans and people across the country.
I know another issue that a lot of people are focused on right now is the aftermath of the deadly rampage in El Paso.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, Senator McSally had proposed a bill that would make domestic terrorism, it would outlaw it federally. What is your thought on that? Because I've read on both sides there are some concerns about doing so.
So I think Martha's bill makes a lot of sense. I haven't studied the particulars of it, but I think as an idea, there's no doubt what we saw in El Paso was terrorism. I mean, I was there in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. I was on the ground visiting with victims' families, with survivors, with those who lost loved ones, with first responders, with physicians and nurses. And what we saw in El Paso was horrific. It was a racist, bigoted mass murderer, a white supremacist, who wrote a manifesto that was just grotesque. It conveyed, on his part, a hatred for Hispanics. I got to tell you, as the son of a Cuban immigrant, as an Hispanic, it was revolting, the hatred of this mass murderer. But we also saw the community come together. We saw the community come together powerfully. And one of the hardest parts of serving in the Senate and representing the state of Texas and one of the most important parts of serving in the Senate is that you have a responsibility to be there on the ground when tragedy strikes, when disaster strikes. I got to say, in the last 3 years, we've seen this happen over and over again. I've been on the ground with Sutherland Springs, the worst church shooting in U.S. history. I've been on the ground with Santa Fe, the horrific shooting at the high school just outside of Houston. Been on the ground here in Dallas when the Dallas 5 were gunned down, and now in El Paso, and I've seen this over and over again. There are too damn many of these. We need to stop them. We need, and I have been leading the effort in the Senate to devote more resources to targeting felons and fugitives and stop them before they carry out a mass murder like this. But at the same time, I want to tell you something that is amazing consistently in each community, one after the other, is that in the face of evil, in the face of bigotry and hatred and murder, we see the communities in Texas come together, they lean on each other, they get stronger. I visited with people I visited with one woman who was shot, and a stranger outside the Walmart in El Paso helped her in his car and drove her to the hospital. A total stranger she'd never met saved her life. That's who Texas is. Texas is not this hatred and bigotry. Texas is the unity and strength that we're seeing right now in El Paso, and El Paso is going to come out stronger.
The shooter in the El Paso shooting was not a fugitive or a felon. So I guess my question is, what is the best way to keep guns out of people who are dangerous?
So there are two approaches to addressing gun violence. One is targeting bad guys, targeting felons, targeting fugitives, targeting those with a real history of mental illness and posing a danger to others. And the other is focusing on law-abiding citizens. What works, what is effective is the first approach, focusing on the bad guys. So one of the very first pieces of legislation I ever introduced in the Senate in 2013 when I was newly elected was what was called the Cruz legislation, and it was designed to target law enforcement resources at felons and fugitives and to stop them from getting firearms. It was in the wake of the Sandy Hook shooting, the horrific shooting up in Newtown, Connecticut, targeting little kids in an elementary school. And the legislation I introduced, it got a bipartisan majority in the U.S. Senate. 52 senators voted for Cruz, including 9 Democrats. It got the most bipartisan support of any of the comprehensive legislation. But sadly, Harry Reid, then the Democratic leader, and the Democrats filibustered the bill and they stopped it. Now here's what the bill would have done. It would have, number one, mandated the Department of Justice to do an audit of every federal conviction to make sure the convictions are in the federal national database. The database is only as good as the convictions that are in it. Number two, it would have directed the Department of Justice to create a gun crime task force and to prosecute gun criminals, and in particular felons and fugitives who lie on their background check applications. Now let me give an example of how we could prevent these kind of crimes. If you look at Sutherland Springs, and I was in the sanctuary the day after that shooting. I saw that beautiful little church covered in blood and shattered glass, and I've gotten to know that community and that congregation very, very well. The shooter in Sutherland Springs, it was already illegal for him to own a firearm or buy a firearm. It was doubly so. He had a felony conviction, and federal law already makes it illegal for a felon to buy a gun. And he also had a domestic violence conviction, and federal law makes it illegal if you have a domestic violence conviction. So why wasn't he stopped? Well, the reason he wasn't stopped is the Obama administration, the Air Force, never reported his conviction to the database. So when he went in to buy his firearms, they ran a background check, but because the felony wasn't in the database, it came up clean. If Cruz had passed, if that legislation hadn't been filibustered, his felony conviction would have been in the database because the federal audit was designed to catch them and ensure that it was there. But number two, even more importantly, it directed the Department of Justice to prosecute him when he lied on the background check form and said he didn't have a felony conviction, he didn't have a domestic violence conviction. Cruz would have said prosecute him for that felony, and that shooter would have been in a federal prison instead of that beautiful sanctuary murdering innocent men, women, and children. We can't stop every violent crime, but we can stop an awful lot of these by focusing on the bad guys, the violent criminals, and stopping them before they commit another murder.
So are you refiling that bill? Because
Yes.
Senator Cornyn passed Fix Nix, the background check, so he covered part that you discussed. But I'm wondering, are you going to refile your bill? And the other thing that we've heard from Democrats is more needs to be done as far as background checks, universally, red flag laws. Where are you on that?
Yeah. So Yes, I have refiled the bill this year. I think we should take it up. I think we need to pass the Grassley-Cruz legislation to strengthen the background check system. That's what my legislation does. You're right, some elements of it have been passed into law, but the heart of it, which is ensuring that all of the convictions are in the database, that the database is more effective, and then prosecuting the felons and fugitives who try to illegally buy guns. That still hasn't been implemented. That needs to be done. With respect to red flag laws, there's a lot of discussion of that right now, and those are one of the tools we're seeing states consider and approach. I think the devil is in the details. It depends on how it's designed. I think it is possible to see a state design a red flag law that would be a beneficial tool if there are real protections of due process, if there's an ability to challenge a determination in court, if there are evidentiary standards. We've seen some states that just allow a judge without any significant due process protections to take away someone's Second Amendment rights. I think that is a mistake and it's dangerous. So when it comes to red flag legislation, how it's designed makes a huge difference, but I think it should be at the state level. I don't think it should be the federal government imposing a solution on the whole country. And in terms of the state of Texas, look, the state of Texas has been vigorous in targeting criminals. I mean, we take that very seriously, and I think we can do more to do that.
Stranger to stranger gun sales. Some have called for background checks because those guns could end up in a terrorist's hands. Where are you on that?
So most of that issue is a question of politics. That's where Democrats focus on primarily. If you look at it right now, background checks are already required for any firearms purchase from a federally licensed dealer. So if you or I go out and buy a firearm, you go to Walmart, you go to a gun store and you buy a firearm, right, you have to commit.
But individuals can do that on their own.
So what is exempted is individual sales or transfers. So if a grandfather gives his son a shotgun to go bird hunting, you don't have to go through federal scrutiny for individual personal transfers. The Democrats focus on that, but here's the thing to know. Virtually none of these mass murders are occurring through that. Their proposal would not have prevented any of the mass murders that we've seen in the state of Texas. It wouldn't have prevented Santa Fe, it wouldn't have prevented Sutherland Springs, it wouldn't have prevented El Paso. They're proposing a solution that wouldn't fix the problem. What I'm proposing actually is directed to fixing the problem. We know that it would have prevented Sutherland Springs, and by taking felons and fugitives off the street who are breaking the law and illegally trying to prevent firearms, preventing them from getting the guns and prosecuting them, we make Texas and the country safer. I want to focus on what works, not a political statement, which we're particularly seeing in the 2020 Democratic presidential primary field. Look, you're seeing Democrats embracing now mandatory gun confiscation. That's a mistake. It's not the right approach to take away the constitutional rights of law-abiding citizens. Focus on the bad guys, not the people who are following the law.
I wanted to talk to you about trade.
Yeah.
The U.S. economy, the Texas economy are booming.
Yeah.
But how concerned are you with this dispute with China, that the uncertainty that businesses have will lead to an economic downturn?
Look, it is a real concern. But let me say at the outset, last 2.5 years, what we're seeing in the economy has been phenomenal. The economy is booming right now. In 2017, Republicans in Congress with majorities in both houses, along with President Trump, passed the biggest tax cut in a generation. And we've repealed job-killing regulations that were hammering small businesses like this foundry that we're at today. The consequence of those two together, the tax cut and repealing job-killing regulations, are that the economy is booming. We've got the lowest unemployment in 50 years. We've got the lowest African-American unemployment that has ever been recorded. We've got the lowest Hispanic unemployment ever recorded. And we're seeing wages going up. The #1 state in the union for wage increases is the great state of Texas. So we're seeing tremendous results. Now, when it comes to trade, the most significant concern that I hear from the Texas business community is uncertainty on trade. And I will say, listen, I believe in free trade. Within the Trump administration, there are divergent views. There are some voices that want to see barriers to accessing foreign markets torn down. They want to see expanded trade. There are other voices within the administration that want to see new tariffs and barriers to the American market and reduce trade. Between those two voices, I am emphatically in the first camp. I believe that when we open up foreign markets, Texas farmers, Texas ranchers, Texas small businesses, Texas manufacturers, we thrive, we do great. Now, in the trade world, it varies in the Trump administration which voice is prevailing at different times. I can tell you, though, I do think the area in trade where I agree the most with the president, has been leaning in hard against China. China is a bad actor when it comes to trade. We don't trade with China on an even playing field. They send in massive amounts of exports to our market, and yet they block their own market. They don't yet let Texas farmers and ranchers and manufacturers in on the same terms. And so I think the president is right to use leverage and lean in on China with an objective, I hope, of opening that market up. If we end up in that scenario where they open up that market and we have more exports, that's good for Texas. On the other hand, if we end up with tariffs all around and a trade war, that's bad for Texas. And so that uncertainty has a lot of Texas business concerned.
And I'm wondering, as far as the USMCA,
Yeah.
the new agreement that would replace NAFTA,
Yes.
is that going to pass?
I hope it passes. I don't know. I think there are easily the votes in the Senate for it to pass. I think it would pass the Senate right now. The big question is the House of Representatives and the Nancy Pelosi Democratic House. Jack, one of the biggest shifts in the last couple of years politically, that actually has not been commented on much, is the demise of the free trade Democrat. It used to be that free trade was a bipartisan objective. Remember, Bill Clinton signed NAFTA. The last really vocal free trade Democrat in the Senate was Hillary Clinton. And Hillary in 2016, she got demagogued like crazy from the left, from Bernie Sanders, because her husband had signed NAFTA. And what we've seen is congressional Democrats running away from free trade. That concerns me. I don't know if Nancy Pelosi will take it up for a vote, and I don't know if the Democratic majority in the House will vote for it. If the House passes it, the Senate will pass it as well. But it really is up right now to the Speaker. And I will say there are a lot of Republicans in the Senate who have expressed concern. This is a concern I have, that so much of what House Democrats are doing is about presidential politics and hating President Trump. That there's real concern whether Speaker Pelosi would be willing to give the president any policy victory heading into this election. If she's not, if they put politics ahead of policy, that's a real shame, because I'll tell you, Texas benefits enormously from trade with Mexico and trade with Canada. We need to continue that and expand that.
I wanted to ask you about a bill you filed very early in the year about term limits.
Yeah.
How realistic is that going to pass?
I hope it passes. I can tell you what is very realistic is the American people support it. The American people support term limits emphatically. 70–80% of Americans support term limits, and it's totally bipartisan. An overwhelming majority of Republicans support term limits, an overwhelming majority of Democrats support term limits, an overwhelming majority of independents support term limits. The one group that doesn't support term limits is career politicians in Washington. And before I was elected to the Senate, I supported term limits, but now I do so 1,000 times more. Because Washington's corrupt. There's a reason it's called the swamp. And it's a bipartisan corruption where you get career politicians who stay there forever and who just grow and grow government. They grow and grow our deficit and debt. And I think term limits are a structural reform to address and fix the problem. What are the likelihood of its passing? I don't know. The first challenge is to get a vote. I'm urging our leadership to schedule it for a vote. Those senators who've been there a really long time, they don't want to vote on this. And I can tell you, I chair the Constitution Subcommittee, the Senate Judiciary Committee. So just a couple of months ago, I chaired a hearing on term limits. We brought in witnesses trying to shine a light, trying to address it. It's what the people of Texas want. It's what the American people want. We just need Congress to listen to the people.
I know you were just reelected, but it does beg the question. Is this going to be your last term in office?
You know, I'm 6 months into it, so let me not make any commitments 6 years from now. What I will say is I have introduced term limits. I support them. I advocate for them. I will vote for them. I'm fighting for them. I want to see them passed. And I would more than happily step down. You know, what the framers had envisioned of Congress is that you'd have citizen legislators who would spend a time serving in Congress, but then would go back and get an honest living. And I would be, nothing would make me more thrilled to pass this amendment and see it implemented. Now, I've never promised to unilaterally disarm. I've never promised to say, well, I'm going to impose it against me and nobody else. I think it should apply against everybody, and I'm going to keep fighting to make that happen.
One other topic, if I may, and that was just about, you've said a lot about anti-Semitism.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I know in Dallas next month, mm-hmm. they are going to be opening a new Holocaust museum. And so I'm wondering, we've seen shootings at synagogues by white supremacists. So what's your thought about this issue and what needs to be done to prevent it and solve it, if possible?
Listen, anti-Semitism is a unique and grotesque evil. And we're seeing a rise of it globally. We're seeing a rise of it in Europe. Anti-Semitism is becoming more and more commonplace in Europe. And we're seeing a rise of it in America. And one of the most troubling developments is as the congressional Democrats have gotten more and more extreme and more left-wing, you are seeing anti-Semitic tropes being repeated. You know, you've got these handful of freshman House members, Democrats, who repeat really nasty anti-Semitic tropes. One tweeted out about Prime Minister Netanyahu, it's all about the Benjamins. Which is an old anti-Semitic trope saying that Jewish voters are just motivated by money instead of substance and policy. That was wrong. It was, and you know, Jack, it was really troubling. So when that happened, the House brought up a resolution condemning anti-Semitism. It was actually Speaker Pelosi who wanted to condemn anti-Semitism. And the Democratic conference in the House couldn't pass it. They discovered their conference fractured. They ended up watering the resolution down so that it simply condemned bigotry of all kinds against anybody, and it was so bland as to say nothing. Now, when I saw that happen, I was deeply troubled, and I hoped that the Senate could do better. And so I drafted and introduced a resolution unequivocally condemning anti-Semitism, the unique bigotry and evil that has gone back millennia, that manifests today in things like the modern BDS movement, the movement to boycott and divest and sanction from the nation of Israel. I introduced this along with Tim Kaine, Senator Tim Kaine from Virginia. Obviously, he was the vice presidential nominee under Hillary Clinton as Democrat. Tim and I introduced it together. We fought together to get it passed. We ended up getting, I think it was 52 co-sponsors, including 14 Democrats. And it ended up passing the U.S. Senate unanimously. 100-0. We united every Republican, every Democrat condemning anti-Semitism. I think that was a really positive development. It was important to see. I don't want to see Israel or anti-Semitism reduced to a partisan issue. I want to see bipartisan commitment to Israel and combating anti-Semitism. And it was important to see this pass the Senate unanimously. You know, in the wake of everything we've seen, I think the House should take up the resolution. It's the Cruz-Kaine resolution that has passed the Senate unanimously. The House ought to take it up, and they need to vote on it. And in particular, I hope you can see House Democrats willing to part from these really angry and extreme left-wing voices in their party, because that should not be a growing force in American politics.
Senator Cruz, thank you for your time. I really appreciate it. Thank you.